Hi, today we're going to divide the lesson. It's been organized into three parts. We're going to talk about globalization and the cultural imperialism hypothesis, as well as the economic relationships to globalization, and what the textbook refers to as global finance, capital, what those formations look like, and how they impact the idea of collective identities. And so when we talk about identity, we're talking about this is multi-scalar. Identities happen both nationally within the nation state, right? We have identities as U.S. Americans. Britain has a particular identity that's felt. And in the book, they talk about the identity of Australia and challenges therein, being a settler colonial state. Um, and media networks have always been incredibly central to these processes. The printing press is largely credited with building a national identity. With the rise of newspapers and print journalism, we were able to read about people that were outside our immediate circle, and we were able to begin to think about them as being part of our lives. And so having a national press really creates a sense of unity and shared identity. Now, with globalization and a multinational corporations, but also transnational media, we see identity taking on new formations. We can maintain identities across space and time, and so diaspora and immigrant communities. The media they consume can be from their home country still. We also don't have mass media the way that we've traditionally thought about it. We have narrowcasting, we have multiple streams of ways of getting information and watching entertainment content. And so I would have a difficult time finding a show that we have all seen every episode of. And that was not the case 10, 15 years ago, when there were fewer channels and there were media spectacles that sort of united people together to watch them. And so the Orgad reading talks about the role of spectacles, such as New Year's Eve celebrations, and some of the examples we'll talk about in the next lesson will be looking at how the Olympics constructs a particular national brand. And so these are some of the ways that identity is being used. And so media has always been used to kind of perpetuate both democracies. If you've been following any of the work on how Nazi Germany used media, they created a lot of spectacles and movies that kind of helped garner support for the fascist project. We certainly, Disney produced cartoons during World War II that supported the internment of the Japanese. And so fascism, socialism, liberal democracies all use media to kind of create an identity and send a particular message. And so the objectives with this lesson, we're going to talk about theories of cultural imperialism and how the mass media represents soft power and perpetuates U.S. ideology abroad. So first off, what is globalization? It's an economic and social process. And so it's not only based on multinational corporations, which we've seen increase under neoliberalism. And of course, as we've discussed neoliberalism, it's an economic arrangement that has social impact. And so not only does the sort of ideology of free markets impact how companies do business and how nation states negotiate with each other, it also impacts how what sort of content is perpetuated. And so the textbook calls global network capitalism. And so that's just the idea that a few major corporations sort of own most of the finance capital. And we've seen an increase in finance capital and banking industries in recent decades. And so we've got these networked nodes across the world of development. And within that, then, the role of the nation state has been challenged. So if companies no longer need the nation state, what is nation state essentially good for? Um, and one of the things that it does, it's a symbolic resource. And so we have a lot of imagery that, such as the flag, that creates a symbolic sentiment. It also helps create an imagined community. We imagine ourselves as part of a particular process. And increasingly, as the textbook talks about, it's a brand. And so within global network capitalism, we're looking, areas are looking to attract investment. They want to bring companies to their country or their city or region. And so how do they create an identity that says, hi, we're open for investment and we are a safe, secure place to put your money and build your company? And so branding has become incredibly important in that. And so there we see the nation state adopting the logic of consumerism insofar as they're marketing themselves to private enterprises. And so this is an example, a headline from 2013. Malaysia needs to relax foreign ownership policies to encourage foreign direct investment. And so we have a billionaire investor suggesting that Malaysia as a nation state take particular actions in order to increase investment in its private sector. So there's several dimensions of global cultural flows. And so this is taken from the work of Arjun Appadurai. He's an anthropologist who's written extensively on globalization. And so he talks about different ways that global network capitalism has impacted society. And he identifies these, he calls them scapes. And he does that because they're not located in any one site. The entire country doesn't necessarily experience this similarly. It's an uneven development where some areas of a city might be kind of gentrified. We see a lot of gentrification happening in Los Angeles and San Francisco, while other areas are left out. And so we have uneven development technologically. Broadband, internet, for example, isn't available everywhere. But some centers are incredibly high tech and developed while others are left behind. And so he talks about this in terms of ethnoscapes. With globalization and transnationalism, we see an increase in tourists. We have tourists. We have, and that's of two types. We have global elites who are able to live pretty much anywhere in the world they want to, or in several locations. They might be in Paris, London, New York, LA, San Francisco, Lima, and they have their existence is pretty much the same no matter where in the world they are. They have money and amenities, but we also have, on the other hand of that, migrants and refugees. And these are people who are moving really not because they have a choice in the matter, but because they have to, whether it's because of war, as in Syria, or changes with global warming. And so we've seen in the Philippines a lot of people moving from outer areas into Manila as their livelihoods are affected due to the changes in the climate. And so we also have guest workers, which we have quite a bit of in the United States. And so as economic needs change and to service our industries, we have guest workers. And a lot of times guest workers are also providing services for wealthy elites in urban centers. Another change has been mediascapes. And so this again goes back to the idea that media helps us form, it's a resource for understanding the world. And so Appadurai talks about image-centered, narrative-based accounts of strips of reality. These offer elements out of which scripts can be formed of imagined lives. And so we experience the world outside ourselves largely through media. We might have never been to Paris, but we probably have an idea of what we would expect when we get there, right? Flower boxes and windows, gorgeous architecture, baguettes, the Eiffel Tower. Similarly, we sort of know what to expect when we get to New York because we've seen it mediated so many times. Another thing is the technoscapes, the spatial distribution of technology, which I talked about earlier. Financescapes are the networks of finance, and idioscapes, political images, state ideologies, and then counter ideologies. And so ideas that vary by nation around freedom, welfare, rights, and sovereignty. And a case study, both Europe and European countries and the United States are based on the idea of a liberal democracy. But what that means and how that is interpreted changes drastically between each nation state. And so the idea of what sovereignty means or privacy and how freedom is thought about, that those discourses shift dramatically between, say, the United States and Germany or France. And so, those are idioscapes, ideological landscapes that change across the world and coalesce in certain times and moments, and then are disparate in others. And so we've got very different streams and flows of culture. And so globalization can also be thought of as a deterritorialization. And so if we think about territorialization, that means that like the territory matters, that the space you're in matters. With technology and global finance capitalism, we don't need territories so much anymore. Companies can pick up and move across the globe. We can talk to each other from wherever we are in the world through technology. And so this brings classes into contact. We're in closer contact with difference than we ever have been before. It also has perhaps led to a rise in global fundamentalism. With globalization, we've seen a resurgence in nationalism and regionalism. And so in some ways, there's been a counter effort, right, among the cosmopolitanism that globalization promised, right? The idea of being able to experience the whole world. We also have a resurgent reactionary nationalism and that's emerging in both the United States and France and increasingly across the globe. And so, but you're also globalization creating new markets for media and tourism. And so we've seen media products such as films change with an eye towards succeeding in the global market. And so a lot of the action films we've seen emerge over the past 2 decades, they're good for Hollywood because they're easy to dub over, they play well abroad, they don't rely as much on cultural sensibilities that perhaps rom-coms or drama does. And so they're easy to export, and they make their money back domestically, and then everything that they export is gravy. We also export a lot of our television content. We frequently get into trade fights with the European Union or some countries that have what we call protectionist policies. And so in France, 60% of all television shows aired, give or take, need to be, it changes at various times, need to be French produced or produced within the European Union. Canada has similar policies, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about cultural imperialism and protectionism. And so, what is the role of the nation? And the nation differs in many ways from the state. The state is the kind of government apparatus that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of power. And so anyone who uses military power or military tactics outside of state-sanctioned activities is considered a terrorist or a resistance organization. The nation, moreover, though, is a set of cultural and ideological allegiances. And so we have an idea, the nation of exists outside of the state in many cases, and the nation state as a coherent whole emerged at a particular historical moment. And so in a country like Spain, where I've done my research looking at nationalism, there are several different nations within the Spanish state. And so the state is an administrative unit, while the nation has a emotional connection. And so Catalonia, País Vasco, and Galicia are all independent nations, and they articulate their nationalism through linguistic difference. They each have their own language that is separate from Castilian Spanish. Geographic history, they have regional histories that vary apart from what the Spanish state imagines itself to be. And those are some of the resources, and there are different traditions. And so you see a very vibrant national culture in these places that really sets itself differently from Spain. And in a lot of ways, that's also part of the branding of the area. And so within the nation then, and as the case study of Spain makes clear, how do you, who has power and what's the level of autonomy? And so under the fascist dictator Francisco Franco in Spain, you couldn't speak alternative languages. You had to speak Castilian Spanish, Galician, Catalan, and Basque were not allowed to be spoken in public or in the school system. And so the question becomes who speaks and for whom? Does the state represent the nation? Also, within the nation, and the idea of the nation state, international organizations such as the UN and UNESCO help provide a voice for developing nations. And so there's a lot of concern historically over how developing nations can sort of create themselves and enter into a global network with some level of autonomy. And this is important to think about in terms of the role of the nation. Which brings us to soft power, and this should be recognizable as part of how hegemony functions, the ideological role. And so it also is a way of thinking about cultural domination. And so soft power, it's the persuasion rather than force. And one of the concerns that emerged when the cultural imperialist philosophy developed was around the problems with the post-colonial nations and the debt and poverty that colonialism left them in. Have they been able to resist cultural domination by U.S. and Western interests? And scholars often point to the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in creating a neo-colonialist relationship among these countries. And so one of the things that develops here is a sense of inequality and relationships between nation states. And how can you resist perhaps companies setting up a sweatshop in your country if you are a developing country? What is the role of tourism then in your nation? And so this vulnerability became something of a concern beginning in the 1960s. And so our economic power as a dominant economic interest in the world is waning, but cultural power remains strong. And so we export our culture, and with that we export our ideology. And that often is what serves the interest of global network capitalism. And so the goal of media is to promote consumer capitalism. And so as we export media, we're also exporting those social relationships. So what are some of the pitfalls of the models of cultural imperialism? One is that it talks about it in terms of cultural domination, which is too simplistic. Subsequent research has found that and we've talked about negotiated readings and how we decode things differently. And so while there's always a dominant message and a preferred meaning, we do adapt and adopt things and make them our own. Culture is not a fixed entity, it moves. Media imperialism, the concern with media products, presumes that media is the central issue in cultural imperialism. And then discourses of nationality. We're really kind of dealing with culture belonging to particular geographic spaces. And culture is not a natural phenomenon. It emerges through human interaction and not necessarily space. And so are we fixing ideas of culture in a static sense that might be harmful, or at least not related to how capitalism and global culture would interact? And how do we think about capitalism as culture? So there's also a critique of modernity, and that modernity is going to kind of homogenize society. And you see this in the Kara Lowe discussion. Or is there a danger of romanticizing tradition and what traditional values might be? And so these are important things to think about as we think about how the media produces particular identities. It reifies or makes identities seem particularly static in particular ways, and it also, may and sometimes even serve to narrow the positionalities available within those discourses. So the media imperialist perspective emphasizes the economic relationships. It loses sight of the particularities of individual lives. And it's important to ask the question in this context, how do people experience capitalism? So does capitalism serve as a mediating influence, or how do traditional notions, and cultural ideas around religion, gender, mediate and interact with capitalism globally? So some central questions we arrive at: is the media determining cultural experience? Or is it simply part of a wave of cultures? And so Apadurai's perspective and that of Kara and Lowe is that it's really part of a larger experience of the world. Apadurai talks about it. It informs us, it provides images and swaths, but it isn't necessarily determining. And indeed, Kara and Lowe, in a cultural studies perspective, would resist any sort of determinative relationship. And so media and culture can be seen as an interplay of mediations. And what we have here is a graphic looking at sort of the cycle. So you have culture as your lived experience, then it's mediated. We see culture as representation, and then another mediation. And so this is sort of a way to think about it where it's not determining or static, but rather constantly in flow. But if we think about cultural imperialism as cultural domination, we're looking at threats to the autonomy of cultures. We're thinking about cultural identity as static, and that national identity is an abstraction. And so Tomlinson, who's one of the premier theorists of globalization and its cultural impact, asks if cultural imperialism is a threat to national cultural identity, it must be a threat to the experience of belonging. And so we see this sort of tension between cultural identity as being something fluid that we can experience in a diverse manner, but there is a certain extent question of what are the limits of that, and how does cultural imperialism threaten the idea of belonging to a particular imagined community. And so Geertz writes, culture is not power, something to which social events can be causally attributed. It is a context, something within which they can be intelligently described. And so for Clifford Geertz, who's one of the premier anthropologists, culture is a way of understanding events. And so we understand meaning through understandings of culture. However, it isn't a causal factor. The transformation of everyday subjectivities through electronic mediation and the work of the imagination is not only a cultural fact, it is deeply connected to politics through the new ways in which individual attachments, interests, and aspirations increasingly cross-cut those of the nation state. So what Apadurai is talking about here is concerns that the power of the nation state and its symbolic importance to our sense of belonging and imagined communities is being disrupted by globalization and transnational neoliberalism. And so the transformation, how we're changing, how our subjectivity is changing, and how our imagination is altered by these financial and political processes is connected to politics, and it changes our aspirations, attachments, and interests are no longer nationally bound. And so this leads to some questions, right? How is culture transmitted? this can be a more important question than homogenization. And so one of the things that had previously happened when we could speak of a national mass media was that there was a homogenizing effect. And this could be seen as a benefit or a detriment. But, US media in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s created sort of a homogenous US culture you could speak of. And that is no longer the case. And so we can't really think of these things as transgenerational. And it's more difficult to speak of a unified culture that's homogenous. And so as deterritorialization occurs, as people move across the globe and cultures become sited in various places, you have these rituals, language, and foods becoming politicized as they're deterritorialized. And so these are increasingly questions when we talk about assimilation of refugees or immigrants, right? This is a political question, and it's often marked by not speaking English or wanting to maintain your native or familial language. Similarly with the foods one eats or rituals one practices. And so these things become political tools and part of our political discourse as deterritorialization moves bodies and meanings and cultural practices across the globe. And so what Appadurai and a lot of the authors we've read for this week conclude is that imagination is now political. Our imagination is a collective social fact, and it's also a social practice. And it's become a key component to the global order. And so how we imagine ourselves and what we imagine to be the possibilities of our lives. And these are some things we've talked about the media perpetuating through creating certain identities, accommodating resistance through hegemonic processes. Right, those are social practices, and they're part of how we maintain the global order through soft power. Thank you. Now please proceed to the question and answer